The studio air crackled with a silence so absolute it felt like a sound. Every camera lens was a black, unblinking eye. My opponent, Marcus Thorne, was sheet white, a ghost in a $1,000 suit. In the front row, my wife, Eleanor, a porcelain doll of betrayal, hadn't moved a muscle. The moderator's voice was a fragile whisper. "Mr. Finch, could you repeat that?" The explosion came a second later, a roar of reporters, a supernova of camera flashes. I gripped the podium, the polished wood cool beneath my fingers. I had just set my entire world on fire, and for the first time in a year, the warmth felt like justice. "My name is Arthur Finch, and this is how I destroyed them." Eleanor wasn't just my wife. She was the architect of my image, grace, intelligence, the perfect Virginian matriarch in waiting. She stood by me, smiling for the cameras, while sleeping with the man trying to politically bury me. And Marcus Thorne, he wasn't just a rival. He was my college roommate, the man who was best man at my wedding. We'd built this campaign from the ground up, fueled by cheap coffee and a shared vision for Virginia. The three of us were supposed to be a team. The betrayal wasn't a single act. It was a conspiracy staged in my own home, planned over my own dinner table. I found out by accident. A misplaced hotel keycard on her nightstand, for a room 2 blocks from his apartment. The dates matched a charity gala she'd attended alone. For months, I played the part. The devoted husband, the oblivious candidate. I watched them exchange knowing glances at fundraisers. I smiled as they planned my downfall behind my back. They saw me as a pawn in their game, a stepping stone on their path to power. But a pawn can become a king when it reaches the other side of the board. Marcus's best man speech at our wedding was legendary. He stood there, raising a glass of champagne, and called the three of us the Virginia Trinity. He said I was the heart, Eleanor was the soul, and he was the mind that would bind it all together. Our guests cheered. I believed him. At the time, it felt like a promise. Now, it sounds like a mission statement for a hostile takeover. The campaign was born from that same energy. In the early days, we were inseparable, sketching out policy on diner napkins and dreaming of the governor's mansion. I was the face, the handshake, the voice on the stump. I was so focused on winning the voters that I neglected my own war room. I gave Eleanor the reins to our public image, our messaging. She was brilliant at it. And I made Marcus my campaign manager, the architect of our strategy. I handed them the keys to the kingdom and never once thought to check if they were changing the locks. The change was a slow poisoning. It started with late-night strategy sessions I was apparently too tired to attend. Whispers that would stop the second I entered a room. Their private jokes, their shared glances over my head during donor calls. They started finishing each other's sentences. Soon it wasn't Arthur's platform anymore. It was our vision. They spoke about my political future as if it were a property they co-owned, one they were preparing to flip. I remember walking into my own study late one night. The door was ajar. They were huddled over a map of voting districts, their heads nearly touching under the low light of a desk lamp. The air was thick, charged. Marcus's hand was on the back of Eleanor's chair. It wasn't overtly romantic, but it was proprietary. "Everything all right?" I asked, my voice making them both jump. Eleanor looked up, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. "Just stress testing the northern counties," she said, smooth as glass. "Marcus thinks we're vulnerable there." Marcus nodded, his face a perfect mask of professional concern. "We have to protect you, Arthur," he added, his gaze steady and cold. "From every angle." The words hung in the air, a threat disguised as loyalty. I let it go. I let 100 such moments go. Why? Because to doubt them was to admit the entire foundation of my life. My marriage, my closest friendship, my campaign was built on sand. I chose to be blind because the truth was unthinkable. They weren't just having an affair, they were staging a quiet coup. They were building a throne for Marcus, using my name and my money as scaffolding. They saw me as the perfect candidate, charismatic, popular, and completely under their control. A puppet king. They just forgot that sometimes the puppet learns how to pull the strings. The hotel keycard was the poison dart. Small, silent, and utterly lethal. But I needed to know how deep the poison went. Was this just a cheap affair, or was it the treason I felt coiling in my gut? The answer, I suspected, wasn't on their phones. They were too smart for that. It would be somewhere they felt safe. Somewhere I had given them. Our home network had a shared drive, a digital filing cabinet Eleanor had set up for campaign continuity. I hadn't looked at it in months. That night, with the house still and Eleanor sleeping soundly in the guest room, claiming a migraine, I sat in my study, the glow of the monitor painting my face in cold blue light. I typed in the password. Timed Richmond 2024 DOMS. Simple. Arrogant. There were folders for everything. Donor lists, media strategy, polling data. But one folder was different. It was named Archives. Empty, at first glance. But a quick search for hidden files revealed a single, password-protected document. My heart hammered against my ribs. A password? What would she use? Not our anniversary, not a birthday. Something only she and Marcus would know. I tried the name of the bar where we'd all met in college. Times the Cavalier. Access granted. The document was titled Project Ascendant. It wasn't a love letter, it was a corporate takeover strategy, and I was the company being gutted. It was a meticulously detailed, 30-page plan for the first year of the Finch administration. My administration. Except my name only appeared as a placeholder, a tool to be used and discarded. Page after page laid out their blueprint. For the first 6 months, I was to be the celebrated face of victory. They'd use my political capital to push through Marcus's key appointments and legislation. Then, Phase 2 would begin. A carefully orchestrated media campaign, managed by Eleanor, would sow whispers of instability. An anonymous source leaking stories of my erratic behavior. A planted photo of me looking exhausted. A manufactured health scare. They weren't just planning to cheat on me, they were planning to medically and politically neuter me. The endgame was outlined on page 28, under the heading, Voluntary Transition. They would corner me, armed with their manufactured evidence and a phony diagnosis from a hand-picked doctor, and pressure me to resign for the, quote, good of the Commonwealth. The lieutenant governor, a man whose campaign Marcus had secretly financed, would ascend. Marcus would be his chief of staff. The kingmaker, finally taking his throne. Eleanor's reward was listed as a seat on the state's most powerful economic development board. A footnote. I scrolled back to the executive summary, a single paragraph that summarized their entire philosophy. One sentence burned itself into my memory. The asset, AF, is charismatic but emotionally compromised, making him the ideal vessel for initial acquisition but a liability for long-term governance. The asset, a vessel. I closed the laptop. The quiet hum of the computer was the only sound in the room. They hadn't just broken my heart, they had itemized my soul for liquidation. The puppet didn't just learn how to pull the strings. The puppet had just read the script and decided to write his own ending. The debate was in 3 months. I had my stage, my audience, and a truth more explosive than any political scandal they could ever invent. I would let them build their house of cards as high as it would go. I would wait until they were standing on the very top, admiring the view. And then I would kick it out from under them. I didn't sleep. I sat in that leather chair until the first pale fingers of dawn crept through the blinds, striping the walls of my study. The rage had burned out, leaving behind something cold and pure and diamond hard. Purpose. They had mistaken my love for weakness, my trust for blindness. I would not make the same mistake. When I finally stood, my legs were stiff, but my mind was perfectly clear. I was no longer a husband or a friend. I was an architect, and I was about to design their ruin. I walked into the kitchen as Eleanor was pouring coffee, the picture of domestic grace in a silk robe. She smiled, a bright, practiced thing. "You were up late," she said, her voice a soft melody. "Big day today. Marcus is coming over to run through the new polling data." "Is he?" I said, taking the mug she offered. I let my fingers brush against hers. I felt nothing. No spark, no revulsion, just the cool touch of porcelain. Good. We need to be prepared. From every angle. I used his own words, watching for a flicker of recognition in her eyes. There was none. To her, I was still just the set dressing. The asset. Marcus arrived 20 minutes later, all sharp suit and sharper ambition. He clapped me on the shoulder. "Ready to save the Commonwealth, Arthur?" We sat at the dining room table, the three of us, just as we had 1,000 times before. They spread out the charts and graphs, pointing to swing districts and voter demographics. They spoke of my campaign, my future. They used my name like a brand they owned. I nodded. I listened. I asked the right questions. I played the part of the dutiful candidate, the grateful husband, the trusting friend. I saw the subtle glances they exchanged over the top of a spreadsheet, the slight pressure of her hand on his arm when she passed him a pen. Before, these moments were invisible static. Now they were blindingly clear, evidence in a trial only I was aware of. "The debate against Thorne is our kill shot," Marcus said, leaning forward, his eyes gleaming. "We need a moment, something authentic that connects, something that shows your heart." I looked from his face to Eleanor's, her expression a perfect mask of supportive concern. They were so confident, so sure of their vessel. I smiled, a slow, easy smile I didn't feel. "Don't worry, Marcus," I said, my voice steady. "I have a moment planned. It's going to be the most authentic thing anyone has ever seen. I promise you, when I'm done, no one will ever forget it." They bought my performance completely. For the next 3 months, I was the most dedicated candidate, the most pliable asset they could have wished for. My days were a masterclass in deception. I gave the speeches they wrote, shook the hands they pointed me towards, and smiled for the cameras with an emptiness in my eyes that they mistook for campaign fatigue. But my nights were my own. While they slept, believing their coup was on schedule, I was waging a silent, one-man war. The first move was financial. Their plan required my resources. I intended to cut off their supply lines. I met with my personal lawyer, a bulldog of a man named Frank who had handled my family's affairs for 30 years, in a dusty law library far from the campaign's orbit. I slid the Project Descendant document, printed and bound like a corporate prospectus, across his mahogany desk. Frank read the first 2 pages, his expression hardening from confusion to cold fury. He didn't ask about the emotional toll. He just looked up, his eyes like chips of granite, and asked, "What's the objective?" "Containment," I said. "I want every joint asset, every shared account, frozen or transferred into a new trust. A trust they cannot touch, see, or even know exists. I want my finances to become a black box. By the time I'm done, Eleanor's credit card should be as useful as a library card from a school that burned down." Frank nodded slowly. "This is financial scorched earth, Arthur." "They drew the map," I replied. "I'm just following it." The second move was to secure a loyalist inside the campaign. I needed eyes and ears. I found them in Sarah Jenkins, a junior press aide in her mid-20s. I'd hired her myself, impressed by her quiet competence and the fact she was the only person on staff who still called me Mr. Finch, not Arthur. She was an outsider, loyal to the man, not the machine Marcus and Eleanor had built. One evening, I asked her to stay late, ostensibly to review press clippings. We sat in my quiet campaign office, the buzz of the main bullpen a distant hum. "Sarah," I began, my voice low, "I have a task for you. It's off the books. It requires total discretion. Your name will never be attached to it, and if you'd rather not, I will understand, and we will never speak of it again." She met my gaze without blinking. "What do you need, sir?" "I need you to compile a dossier," I said, sliding a blank folder across my desk. "Not on our opponent. On our campaign manager." I watched her for any sign of hesitation. There was none. "I want travel records, expense reports, phone logs. I want to know every meeting Marcus Thorne has taken for the last 6 months that wasn't on my official schedule. I want to know who he's talking to, where he's going, and who's paying for it. You will report only to me via a new, encrypted email address. Can you do that?" She took the folder. "Yes, sir," she said, her voice firm. "I can." She didn't ask why. She didn't need to. She'd seen the whispers and the closed-door meetings. She knew something was wrong. I had just given her a side to pick. The final piece was the irrefutable proof. Project Ascendant was the motive, but I needed the murder weapon, the visual evidence of the affair that would leave no room for doubt or denial. I hired a private investigator, a former state trooper with a face like a roadmap of bad neighborhoods. We met in a parked car on a rainy Tuesday. "I don't want a scandal sheet," I told him, the windshield wipers keeping a steady, hypnotic rhythm. "I don't want grainy pictures of them going into a hotel. I need one photograph, clear, undeniable, something that says conspiracy, not just infidelity. I want it to look like what it is, a business meeting between partners." He found them 2 weeks later, not at a hotel but at a quiet corner table in a discreet restaurant downtown, on a night Eleanor had told me she was at a book club. The photograph he delivered was a work of art. They were leaning close together, their heads nearly touching. Marcus was sliding a piece of paper across the table, a page of my debate prep, I later realized. Eleanor's hand was resting on his, not in a lover's caress, but in a gesture of solid, conspiratorial agreement. They weren't just lovers, they were co-conspirators, sealing a deal. I had the photo scanned and saved it in a file named Trinity. With my assets secured, my intelligence network in place, and my evidence locked and loaded, all that remained was to set the stage. I needed to control the narrative of the debate. I couldn't just launch into my accusation. It had to be drawn out of me. I needed the right question from the right journalist. I found my instrument in Brenda Wallace, a veteran political reporter for a rival network, a sharp-witted journalist whom Marcus had personally blackballed from our press pool after a tough line of questioning early in the campaign. 3 days before the debate, an anonymous, encrypted email landed in her inbox. It contained no threats, no grand revelations. Just a single tantalizing sentence. "Ask Finch about the real Virginia Trinity. He's a man who values loyalty above all else. Ask him what happens when that loyalty is betrayed by those closest to him." It was the perfect bait. Vague enough to be safe, but specific enough to ignite a reporter's instinct. It was a question about my character, my heart, the very thing Marcus wanted me to showcase. The night of the debate arrived. Eleanor stood before me in our bedroom, straightening my tie. The silk felt like a noose. Her hands were cool and steady. She looked up at me, her face a perfect porcelain mask of wifely devotion. "You're ready for this," she whispered, her voice full of feigned encouragement. "Just remember what Marcus said. Be authentic. Show them your heart." She smiled, a dazzling, empty thing. "Knock 'em dead, darling." I looked at my reflection in the mirror over her shoulder. The man staring back was a stranger, hollowed out, cold, but finally, terrifyingly, focused. I met her eyes in the reflection. "Don't worry," I said, my voice unnervingly calm. "I plan to." The first hour was a sterile, predictable dance. I parried attacks on tax policy and traded blows on infrastructure spending, using the exact talking points Marcus had drilled into me. On stage right, Marcus Thorne was smooth, confident, radiating the predatory charm that had fooled a state and had fooled me. In the front row, Eleanor sat poised, a statue of supportive elegance. I could feel their shared satisfaction from across the stage. Their asset was performing flawlessly. Their vessel was steering a steady course toward their victory. I let them enjoy the illusion. I let them believe they were in control. Then, in the final block, the moderator turned to Brenda Wallace. Her eyes, sharp behind her glasses, found mine. The moment had arrived. "Mr. Finch," she said, her voice cutting through the studio hum, "you've built your platform on the idea of trust and character. There are whispers of a Virginia Trinity that formed the foundation of your campaign. You've spoken about loyalty as the ultimate political virtue. Can you tell us what happens when that loyalty is betrayed by those closest to you?" A loaded question. A landmine. The camera zoomed in on my face, waiting for a flustered denial. I could see Marcus shift in his seat, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. This wasn't on the approved list. This was a variable he hadn't controlled. I let the silence hang. I let it stretch until it became uncomfortable. I didn't look at Brenda. I looked directly into the central camera, into the living rooms of millions of Virginians. "Thank you, Brenda," I began, my voice perfectly level, devoid of the emotion they expected. "That's the most important question anyone has asked this evening. The Virginia Trinity. It's true. It was a name given to 3 people who swore to build a better future for this Commonwealth. My best man, my wife, and me." I turned my head slowly, deliberately, and locked eyes with Marcus. His practiced smile faltered. "I was told I was the heart of that trinity," I continued, my voice dropping slightly, drawing the audience in. "My wife, Eleanor, was the soul." I glanced towards the front row. For the first time her porcelain composure cracked, a hairline fracture of panic. And my opponent, Mr. Thorne, the man who was best man at my wedding, he was the mind. The studio was dead silent. Every person in the room knew this was no longer a debate, it was a confession. Or an execution. "And that brilliant mind," I said, turning back to the camera, "authored a document. A meticulously detailed 30-page blueprint for my own political destruction. It's called Project Ascendant. I'm sure Mr. Thorne remembers it. He wrote it on my computer, in my study." Marcus went rigid, his face draining of all color. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. "In this document, I'm not referred to as a candidate, or a governor, or even a person. I am referred to as the asset, an emotionally compromised vessel to be used for initial acquisition and then discarded. The plan was simple: win the election on my name, then have me declared mentally unfit and forced to resign within a year. All orchestrated by the 2 people I trusted most on this earth." A collective gasp swept through the live audience. I saw Eleanor press a hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. Not horror at the act, but at its exposure. "You speak of loyalty, Brenda. Let me show you what their loyalty looks like." I reached into my jacket pocket. Not for a phone or a piece of paper. I pulled out nothing. The evidence isn't here with me tonight. I felt it was more appropriate to send it directly to the people who should have it. As we speak, every major news desk in this state, including your own, has received a secure, encrypted file. The file is named Trinity. Now the chaos began. Reporters were scrambling for their phones, producers were screaming into headsets, the moderator was speechless. "In that file," I said, my voice rising just enough to cut through the growing pandemonium, "you will find the entirety of Project Ascendant. You will find financial records detailing how my campaign funds were diverted to finance a shadow administration. And you will find a photograph. A photograph of my wife and my best man, taken 2 weeks ago, at a restaurant where they were finalizing the last details of my political assassination. Their hands are clasped over my debate notes. It wasn't a lover's tryst, it was a business meeting. The business of treason." I looked at Marcus one last time. He was a ghost, a hollowed-out man in a $1,000 suit, exactly as I remembered from the vision that had fueled me for 3 months. I looked at Eleanor. The porcelain doll had shattered. I gripped the podium, the polished wood cool beneath my fingers. The explosion I had imagined was here. A supernova of camera flashes was blinding, the roar of the press a physical force. Security guards surged toward the stage. But they were too late. The damage was done. The moderator was stammering, trying to regain control of a broadcast that had just become a national incident. I didn't wait for him to find the words. I unclipped my lavalier microphone and let it drop. The soft thud on the stage floor was my closing statement, my final vote cast. I walked off stage without a backward glance at Marcus. I didn't need to see him. I could feel his career, his entire future, dissolving into ash behind me. My path took me past the front row, through the barricade of shouting journalists. For a moment, the sea of bodies parted, and I saw her. Eleanor. She was on her feet. her face a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. The perfect porcelain doll was gone, replaced by something jagged and venomous. Our eyes met across the chaos. There was no pain in her gaze, no regret. Only the raw hatred of a co-conspirator, whose perfect plan had just been detonated by the one variable she never thought to control: the asset itself. I felt nothing. The great hollowing grief I had carried for months was gone. The rage had burned itself out. In their place was a profound, chilling emptiness. This wasn't triumph. It was an amputation. Necessary, life-saving, but leaving a phantom limb that would ache forever. Just beyond the lights, Sarah Jenkins was waiting. She stood firm against the tide of panic, a small island of calm. She didn't offer platitudes or ask questions. She simply held out my trench coat and a single car key. "The back exit, Mr. Finch," she said, her voice steady. "They don't know about it yet." I took the key. Her simple act of loyalty was the only thing that felt real in the entire building. As I walked out into the cool, dark alley, the distant wail of sirens began to cut through the city air. I knew I hadn't won the governor's mansion. I had lost my wife, my best friend, and my life's ambition in a single self-immolating act of truth. But standing there, under the quiet Virginia sky, I wasn't a vessel anymore. I wasn't a pawn or an asset. I was just Arthur Finch. And for the first time in a long, long time, my name was my own again. That was the only victory that mattered. So here's the question for all of you. Was I justified in using a live political debate to expose them, or should personal betrayal always be handled privately, no matter what?